I wonder if we have reached the point that technology has become so astounding that it doesn't actually astound us anymore. I think probably, with the exception of Elizabeth and Dan, the rest of us, when we were growing up, the thought of a mobile phone, the thought that I could stand in the middle of a field and speak to pretty much anyone, anywhere in the world, that was beyond our dreams, wasn't it? That was Beam Me Up Scotty. That was Star Trek technology, wasn't it? But now, I mean, the things we can do with the things we've all got, you know, I can speak into it, and apparently, on the other side of the world, what I say will come out in a foreign language if I want it to. It's extraordinary. Rather more mundanely, I can order a pizza which will be delivered in 30 minutes at a house 10,000 miles away. That's just mind-blowing, isn't it? Well, it is astounding, but I don't think we're astounded anymore. When Apple bring their latest bit of kit out, we think, oh yeah, great, something more. Easter Day, the Lord Jesus coming back to life again. We know the story so well, we refer to it virtually every week. Often we say, for our sake, he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, he suffered death and was buried. On the third day, he rose again in accordance with the scriptures. And I think the problem is, we say it so often, we're not astounded by it anymore. Well, this morning we're going to remind ourselves not only that the events of that first Easter are astounding, but we're also going to remind each other of the life-changing implications for you and me of that event that are equally astounding. Let me just ask what your biggest fears are about your life, about your death, about the people you love, and their life and their death. What are our biggest fears? Is it that something irreparably crushing will happen? Is it that your life or their life will just be overwhelmingly sad or lonely or ultimately disappointing or even meaningless? And we all worry about death, especially the death of somebody we love. Well, we're going to remind ourselves this morning that for the follower of Jesus, Easter has changed everything. And you can see my first heading, God's vast power. After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord, came down from heaven and, going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. I know of no serious historian who will deny that Jesus existed, but many will deny that he rose from the dead, and they will say that because they cannot believe that it's possible for someone to rise from the dead. Many have come up with alternative explanations, and one of the most common is that Jesus wasn't actually dead when the Romans cut him down from the cross. He was in bad shape, he was unconscious, and so the Romans just cut him down a bit early. Now, for all sorts of reasons, that is implausible, but in particular, it doesn't explain the other things that happened at the same time. Matthew tells us of a violent earthquake. He tells us of an angel who, I quote, his appearance was like lightning and his clothes were white as snow. What does that look like? I don't know. My guess is as good as yours. But it speaks of someone extraordinary. If you were to look at one of the Old Testament books, Daniel, you will see God himself described in very similar language. Now, this angel was not God, but in appearance he seems very similar. Matthew tells us of a violent earthquake. I've got a friend, a few years ago, he went with his wife and then 2 teenage children on a family expedition to Peru. This was the children are teenagers and soon they're not going to want to come on holiday with us anymore, so let's just do one really big holiday together. It was that sort of occasion. And Peru does suffer from earthquakes, and whilst they were in the interior of the country, there were earthquake warnings and rumblings, so immediately they went to the airport in the middle of Peru to get a flight out. But the whole world was at the airport, and my friend could only get 3 flight tickets. And so he sent his wife and his children off, and he stayed behind. And he said to me he had never been so terrified in his life, because he had no idea whether he would ever see his wife and children again in this life. The angel, the earthquake, the Roman soldiers guarding the tomb. We need to remember Roman soldiers aren't timid. Roman soldiers aren't wimps. They are as hard as nails. Verse 4, the guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The guards were terrified, but unlike my friend, they were not terrified by the earthquake. They were terrified by the angel, and they collapsed, they passed out in sheer terror. Britain's got talent. We see a conjurer saw someone in half and we're slightly curious. Apple launched their latest bit of kit and we're mildly impressed. The guards caught a sight of the terrifyingly powerful God of the universe who had brought back to life an utterly dead corpse, one that had had the life literally beaten out of it 3 days previously, and they were terrified by this power. God's vast power. Secondly, from fear to joy. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the woman, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you're looking for Jesus who was crucified. He's not here. He has risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay, then go quickly and tell his disciples he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you." So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. So these two Marys, they went to the tomb expecting to find a dead body, but Jesus had repeatedly said to them over the previous months, I must go to Jerusalem and suffer many times at the hands of their elders, the chief priests and the leaders of the law. I must be killed, but on the third day I will be raised to life. But it seems that every time he said that, those words were just puzzling and unbelievable to his listeners because it was beyond anyone's experience. So the Marys went to the tomb expecting to find a dead body, and instead they found the empty tomb. We have a number of burials each year in our churchyard. How would I feel if a couple of days after a funeral I were to wander down to the grave and find an empty hole? I would be bewildered. I would be apprehensive. I think I would probably be spooked. The angel approaches the women who did not faint with terror, as the Roman guards did. Rather, they are reassured. They are reminded that this happened. Please note the angel's words in verse 6. They're reminded that this happened just as Jesus had said it would. Perhaps moments earlier, the women had been thinking, well, have we come to the right tomb? Yeah, I can see it was getting dark on the Friday when he was finally buried. Perhaps we have made a mistake. No mistake. The angel showed them the place where he had been laid, the now empty place he had been laid. Where is Jesus? The angel's words are unambiguously clear. He's not staggered off somewhere half dead. He isn't somewhere else as a result of someone having moved the body. He isn't in another tomb because, ladies, you got the wrong one. Where is Jesus? The angel's exact words, verse 6, he is not here. Why? He has risen just as he said. And so verse 8, the women rush off to tell their disciples, afraid, yet filled with joy. That's a curious phrase, isn't it? Afraid, yet filled with joy. And I guess it means they just rushed off with mixed emotions. Their mind was a mush. Well, it would be, wouldn't it? This is scary stuff. But joy? Why joy? Well, probably their minds were a complete whirl, but I imagine they were already beginning to think, we're going to see him again. When he said he was going to come back to life, he really meant it, and he's really done it. Who is this man? Who can do something like this? He spoke with God's authority. He taught with God's wisdom. He acted with God's character. Everything about him pointed to him being God, and now he has risen from the dead just as he said he would. Now, we don't know how far the women got in their thinking in those few minutes, in those few hours on that first Easter Sunday morning. But those of us, all of us here who've had the benefit of years to ponder these things, well, the resurrection of Jesus changes everything for us, doesn't it? If Jesus rose, it tells us that it's possible for a human to rise. Death need not be the end. If Jesus proved the truthfulness of his promise to come back to life, well, it gives me great grounds to believe that everything else he says, is also true. If Jesus died with all my sin placed on him and he came back to life, then I too can come back to life. The women's fear was turning to joy, and maybe properly our fears might turn to joy. Well, the women saw the empty tomb, they heard the angel, they believed the angel's explanation, but the clincher is in verse 9, isn't it? Verse 9, suddenly Jesus met them. Greetings, he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, that's curious, and worshipped him. They saw Jesus, they heard Jesus, they touched Jesus. Did they merely glimpse him from afar? No, they heard his voice. Did they see some sort of weird apparition, some ghost? No, they physically touched his body. They grasped hold of his body. The surprise, I think, is how they touched Jesus. Did these women fling their arms around him? That's, I think, probably what we would have expected, but no, they didn't. Verse 9, they clasped his feet. How do you clasp someone's feet? Well, I think it means you get down on your knees. You get down on your knees and bow before him as they would a king, as they would God. And sure enough, Matthew spells it out. They worshipped him. Let me take you back to Christmas. Let me take you back to the beginning of Matthew's gospel. Do you remember how Matthew starts his gospel? Or pretty soon in, there are those magi coming from the east to worship the newborn king. That's how Matthew starts his gospel. How does Matthew end his gospel? With the two Marys worshipping the newly resurrected king. God's vast power, from fear to joy. And thirdly, God's sensational plan. Yes, we may say, how lovely for the two Marys. Their dead friend wasn't dead anymore, but Jesus makes it clear that his appearance to them wasn't by any means solely for their benefit. Verse 10, don't be afraid, go and tell, says Jesus. Go and tell the other disciples, go and tell them your fear has turned to joy. Why do they need to know that? So that their fear may turn to joy. And indeed, if you look down at verse 19, I know this is outside of this passage, please forgive me, but Jesus' very famous command to all his disciples, therefore go and make disciples of all nations. In other words, Jesus is saying, what I have done, go and tell the whole world. Go and tell all women, go and tell all women, all men, all women, all children, everywhere, that their fear can be turned to joy. God's sensational plan is that very many people may have their pasts completely forgiven, may have their futures completely assured, and may have their presence transformed from fear to joy. Go and tell them, Jesus said, that my rising from the dead, my invitation to all people everywhere to come to me as they are and put me in charge, if that invitation is taken up, it will banish their every fear. Those fears we mentioned a moment or two ago are those fears for ourselves and for our friends. Those fears of having lives where something irreparably sad happens, or our fears for ourselves, for them, of loneliness or meaningless or being rejected by God, our fears of death. In the light of Easter Sunday, we can see that those fears are banished for those who put their trust in Jesus. That those fears are replaced by inexpressible joy, because the follower of Jesus can have the certainty, you can have the certainty, that you are part of God's sensational, eternal plan. Easter, yes, it was a truly astounding event. But if you keep coming to Jesus as you are, if you keep following him, if you keep leaning on him, you will see that Easter answers your every fear. Because it's opened up an astounding and guaranteed eternity for you.